Kyle Reese, a former FBI agent, moves to a quiet farm to escape his past. A seemingly normal family moves in next door, a man, a woman, and 3 kids. But the kids are never outside, the wife avoids Kyle, and bruises appear on her face. Kyle's instincts kick in, something is terribly wrong inside that house. He contacts the police, SWAT storms in and takes the father away in cuffs. But the very next morning, Kyle is stunned to see the man back home. The FBI reveals he's the son of a powerful politician, untouchable by law. Refusing to look the other way, Kyle takes his gun and heads to the neighbor's house. Stay with us to find out how this story ends, and don't forget to subscribe, because more gripping stories are coming just for you. Dark clouds hung heavily over the wide expanse of farmland that once belonged to a thriving family estate. Kyle Reese had owned this land for nearly a decade. Once an FBI detective with a sharp mind and methodical approach to uncovering truths. He became a farmer, trying to escape his intense past. He wanted peace and routine. He wanted order. Routine. And the quiet rhythm of country life. Yet even here, beyond the bustling glow of cities, unpredictability and evil could take root. He occasionally reminded himself that danger was never so far away. No matter how far he tried to run from his past profession. The day the new family moved in next door, he felt an inexplicable shift in the atmosphere. Like a silent wind carrying a warning. In early autumn, Kyle Reese watched with mild curiosity as the neighbor's moving truck pulled up to the small single-story house down the gravel road. A large pickup guided by a tall man in a flannel jacket parked near the front steps. Beside him sat a woman whose posture seemed drawn inward, as though she wanted to become invisible. 3 children emerged from the truck, 2 boys and a girl. All between 8 and 13 years of age. They seemed a bit shy but waved politely when Kyle raised a hand in greeting from his side of the fence. For a moment, Kyle's initial impression was that this was a happy family, smiling father, quiet yet polite mother, and kids who stared around them, taking in the farmland as though it were a new frontier. Their arrival felt calm and innocuous. He turned away, deciding to greet them properly once they had some time to settle. Unaware of the dark tale that was about to unfold. Over the next week, Kyle carried on his daily farm tasks. He repaired a section of fencing damaged in a recent storm, visited the feed store for supplies, and tended to a handful of livestock. He enjoyed the small moments of solitude on his property, reflecting on a life he had left behind. But curiosity grew about the new neighbors. The father, who introduced himself in passing one day, seemed friendly enough. The mother had a soft voice and an apologetic smile, though she spoke rarely and usually lingered in the background when her husband was around. The children peeked from windows but made little noise, as if they were under instructions to remain out of sight. Kyle tried not to read too much into it. After all, each family had its own rhythms and private ways. Yet it lingered in his mind. The sense that something was slightly off about the dynamics of that household. He found himself recalling old training from his FBI days. Observational habits were hard to leave behind. He noted that the children never seemed to come outside on weekdays. He began to suspect they might not be attending school at all. Or if they were, it was done in some unconventional way. Not that homeschooling was so unusual in rural areas. But from what little he saw, it seemed more like they were simply never leaving the house. During a brief friendly conversation at the boundary between their properties, Kyle asked the father politely about the kids' schooling. The man gave a dismissive answer about an online program they had been following, then switched topics with a firmness that indicated Kyle should not press further. It raised a small red flag in Kyle's mind. But again, he reminded himself that people had different ways of living and schooling could be handled at home. Still, a residual sense of unease remained, like a faint echo of tension that refused to fully fade. When the mother emerged occasionally with groceries or stepped outside to hang laundry, Kyle noticed she wore long-sleeved shirts despite the warmth of the season. She kept her eyes downcast, shoulders perpetually slumped, as if fearing any sort of meaningful interaction. Once or twice, Kyle tried to offer a casual hello across the fence, but the mother never met his gaze. She would nod quickly and disappear, as if contact with him might spark trouble. Given his background, Kyle understood the subtle signs of someone who might feel threatened. The look in her eyes triggered old investigative instincts. He told himself it might be harmless, but a whisper of dread seeped through him nonetheless. One late afternoon, as Kyle finished tending to a row of crops behind his barn, he heard a faint commotion coming from the direction of the neighbor's house. It was not loud enough to be identifiable, but it pricked his senses. He walked toward the fence line, straining to see if anything was visibly amiss. The house seemed calm on the outside. No one stood in the yard or near the windows. The blinds were drawn. Unsure if he was simply overthinking, Kyle headed back toward his home, glancing occasionally over his shoulder. The old reflexes of a detective were still alive, no matter how hard he tried to bury them under the routine of farm life. In the following days, the father invited Kyle over for a casual chat, which eased some of Kyle's concerns. They stood by the edge of the driveway, talking broadly about the region, the harshness of winters, and the chores involved in keeping farmland maintained. Kyle noticed how the father spoke in a jovial, almost loud manner, as if wanting to prove that everything in his life was perfectly all right. The father even cracked jokes about the difficulty of raising children in an age where technology and distractions ran rampant, lamenting that discipline was a lost art. Kyle forced a slight laugh, acknowledging the father's comment without delving deeper. He left that interaction with an odd sense that the father was not just making conversation, but perhaps attempting to control a narrative, one where he was an ordinary man, simply doing what he must to keep order in his household. That evening, Kyle tried to focus on reading a book, but found himself glancing often out the window that provided a partial view of the neighbor's yard. He watched for signs of the children. He felt uneasy about not having seen them outdoors for any extended period of time. The next day, he thought maybe he should take a friendlier approach and see if the kids might like to meet his animals. Nothing too intrusive, just a welcoming gesture. He strolled over and knocked on the door. The mother answered. She looked even more withdrawn than usual, her gaze flicking behind her as though someone might be watching. Kyle mentioned that he had goats and chickens that children often found fun to feed. The mother seemed uncomfortable and muttered a near-silent thanks, bowing her head in a way that subtly communicated she wasn't at liberty to accept. The door closed gently, leaving Kyle standing on the porch, unsettled by the abruptness of her manner. He could smell fear in that household, though he could not yet determine the extent of it. Time wore on, and any notion that the children might be free to roam was cast aside. Kyle hardly ever saw them. Meanwhile, the father maintained a polite but distant rapport, waving from his truck or greeting Kyle in passing. If the mother was ever present, she kept a tense posture and spoke as little as possible. The subtle bruises began appearing soon after that. Kyle first noticed them on the mother's arms, faint purple blotches that she unsuccessfully tried to conceal under her sleeves. On another day, as she hurried from her car to the house, Kyle caught sight of a mark on her cheek. She hurriedly turned away before he could see more. A troubling pattern was forming. Memories from Kyle's detective years rose to the surface. He recalled domestic abuse cases, He remembered the hushed voices and fearful eyes of victims who found themselves entangled in situations far more dangerous than outsiders could imagine. His sense of moral responsibility began to weigh on him, urging him to check on the situation more thoroughly. At first, he wrestled with reluctance. After all, he was no longer a detective. And perhaps the situation was not as dark as it seemed. Yet he could not shake the feeling of dread. Late one evening, while checking on his barn, he noticed faint light in a room upstairs at the neighbor's house. The silhouette of a child appeared briefly at the window, then vanished as if startled. Kyle leaned against the barn door, pondering whether to confront the father directly. But his years of investigative work told him that confrontation in cases of suspected abuse could be dangerous. Not only for him but especially for the victimized family. He resolved to be cautious, gather observations, and if his suspicions continued to grow, to contact the local authorities. A new sense of vigilance took hold of him. Through small details like the way the father sometimes gripped his wife's arm a bit too tightly when leading her to the car, or how the children's faces seemed pale and anxious when they did happen to dart outside for a moment, Kyle's alarm intensified. It weighed heavily on his conscience. He began quietly documenting these subtle observations in a small notepad, just as he had done in his FBI days. The father's behavior remained consistently overbearing, though cleverly masked behind a facade of jovial neighborliness when out in public view. Kyle recognized that if these instincts were right, the father might be crossing lines far beyond normal discipline. He recalled complex cases he had worked on involving child abuse, manipulation, and controlling household environments. He also remembered how such criminals often kept their victims silent through threats and psychological coercion. The more he watched, the more certain he became that something grim was transpiring behind those drawn blinds. One rainy afternoon, Kyle spotted the father racing his truck away from the property. Seizing the opportunity to check on the family, Kyle gathered up some fresh produce from his garden and walked over under the pretext of sharing his harvest. The mother opened the door. Up close, she looked exhausted, as if nights of terror had eroded her spirit. He tried to offer her some of the vegetables. She took them with trembling hands. Managing a faint thank you, Kyle asked, in a low voice, if she was all right. She seemed on the verge of confiding something, her lips parting slightly, before she shook her head and backed away, eyes wide with fear. Kyle had to suppress the urge to try and push the door open further, to demand that she explain the bruises. But he knew any sudden move might worsen her situation if the father discovered her talking to another man. So he watched her vanish behind the door. In the days that followed, Kyle found his sleep increasingly disturbed by nightmares of the father's violent presence. He tried reading, tried listening to the radio, tried focusing on normalcy. But his instincts were screaming at him to intervene. He thought about contacting the local sheriff's department. His old experiences with law enforcement told him he would need more than a vague suspicion and glimpses of bruises to motivate a strong response. Still, child welfare investigators might at least show up, ask questions, make an appearance that could, at the very least, convey that someone was watching. But Kyle, still harboring a detective's sense of thoroughness, wanted some piece of tangible evidence. He remembered how often words alone could be brushed aside by manipulative abusers who knew how to twist a narrative and portray themselves as innocent. So he waited, watched, and contemplated a careful approach. At some point, though, enough small pieces of the puzzle had formed a disturbing hole in Kyle's mind. He had seen the mother flinch at sudden sounds and recoil from the father's casual touches, as if each time she feared a blow. He had glimpsed a battered child's face at the window, sporting a bruise near one eye. He knew this was not simply a matter of harsh parenting. The father was a threat. With a mounting sense of moral duty, Kyle decided he had to alert the authorities. Come what may. He reached out to a contact at the local police station, explaining in detail his concerns and the indicators he had observed. He left no doubt that he believed the children were in immediate danger. The responding officer was polite and promised to look into the matter. Kyle felt a sense of relief that the law would soon intervene. That he had done what a good citizen, let alone a former FBI detective, was obligated to do. Yet that relief was accompanied by an undercurrent of anxiety. For he knew how complicated such situations could become. Victims might deny the abuse due to fear. Abusers might slip through legal loopholes. But Kyle pressed on, motivated by the knowledge that to do nothing was to fail those children. A day passed. Then two. A patrol car idled near the neighbor's house at one point, with an officer presumably conducting a brief inquiry. Kyle observed from his yard, his heart pounding, as he hoped that the mother or children might find the courage to speak the truth. Then the patrol car drove away, and the house returned to its unsettling stillness. For the rest of that night, Kyle slept poorly. He experienced flashbacks to the more harrowing child abuse cases he had encountered during his FBI tenure. He wondered if he had done enough, or if he should have involved the FBI directly. But he told himself that local law enforcement had the initial jurisdiction. Patience would be necessary. The next morning, he spotted new bruises on the mother's face as she stepped briefly onto the porch to shake out a rug. A jolt of horror coursed through him. He realized that sometimes, after a police visit, an abuser's temper could worsen, punishing the household for attracting attention. It was a chilling sign that events were escalating. The father's truck had returned sometime during the night, and Kyle wondered if the father was furious over the police inquiry. He felt a flicker of guilt. His actions might have inadvertently caused the abuser to lash out. Yet Kyle reminded himself that the only real culprit was the man who chose to use violence against his family. Determined to press onward, Kyle dialed the local station again and demanded they take stronger action. He explained that the family was likely in increased danger now that the father suspected external interference. The officer on duty informed him that they would be escalating the matter. Though bureaucracy often moved slowly, Kyle's frustration grew. He was no stranger to the steps of law enforcement. But he could not simply stand by while a family remained in peril. He thought about the father's imposing figure, the mother's bruised arms and quiet sorrow, the children's frightened glances. The entire situation was a ticking time bomb. Nonetheless, a part of Kyle knew that forging ahead alone could compromise the investigation or endanger the family further. He could not simply storm into the house without cause. Nor could he lurk about collecting evidence that might be inadmissible in court. He was neither a private investigator nor an active FBI agent anymore. Still, his sense of justice loomed too large to be ignored. And so, he waited for what felt like an agonizing eternity. On a late afternoon, he overheard a commotion in the neighbor's driveway. The father was departing in a furious manner. He shouted something incoherent back toward the house before peeling away. Kyle hurried outside, uncertain what he would do if confronted. He watched the truck vanish into the distance, the sky overhead swirling with ominous clouds. He noticed the mother standing near the open front door, hugging her arms to her chest. At that moment, Kyle felt a pang of deep compassion. He took a step closer, determined to see if she required immediate help. But she vanished into the house and closed the door. The tension in the air felt suffocating. That night, Kyle's mind replayed every nuance he had witnessed since the family's arrival. Each sign, from the children's absence in the yard to the mother's bruises, came together like puzzle pieces revealing a tragic picture. He reminded himself that the father and abuser of children was not simply a harsh disciplinarian. He was dealing with someone who inflicted terror on his own family behind closed doors. Kyle found himself staring into the darkness of his bedroom, a swirl of dread pressing on him. He questioned whether the local police were truly prepared to handle this. There were implications that the father might have powerful connections, or at least exuded a kind of arrogance that suggested he believed himself untouchable. Over the next few days, Kyle's calls to the station bore fruit. A detective visited him at home, taking his statement more thoroughly, nodding grimly at the details Kyle provided. The detective assured Kyle that if they could confirm evidence of abuse, they would have grounds for a more forceful intervention. Kyle's background as a former FBI agent gave his suspicions more weight, and he felt a wave of cautious relief that his claims were not being dismissed. Still, he was told to remain patient, as building a solid case would take time. Kyle found it difficult to abide by that counsel. Patience meant more days, possibly more weeks, in which the mother and children could be suffering unspeakable harm. He thought about what might truly be happening inside that house. His imagination filled the blanks with the worst possibilities, based on cases he had once investigated. He thought of children huddled in fear, bruises forming from repeated assaults. He thought of psychological torment and mental scars that might never fully heal. The father's unwavering smugness in public only exacerbated Kyle's sense of alarm. This was a man who believed he could act with impunity. In the ensuing week, Kyle discreetly observed the property, noting any unusual activity. Late one night, he caught sight of the oldest child, perhaps the 13-year-old boy, stepping out onto the porch for a moment. The boy looked up at the sky, as though in silent prayer for a miracle. Then a shape inside the house seemed to yank him back in. Kyle's heart sank. He realized that to do nothing was an abandonment of everything he stood for, both as a decent human being and as a former lawman. And so, the stage was set for a clash between Kyle Reese's moral imperative and the father's menacing presence. The gray gloom of the autumn skies and the lonely silhouette of the neighbor's house only deepened the sense that tragedy hovered just out of sight. For Kyle, there would be no easy escape from the tension that had settled over his farm. The puzzle of what lay behind those drawn shades and the haunting glimpses of fear in the mother's eyes all but guaranteed that he would soon become more deeply involved than he ever intended. Yet, as he squared his shoulders and scanned the horizon from his modest living room window, Kyle could not have known how drastically events would unfold. The question that lingered in the silence was whether the system in which he had once believed would be enough to protect that family, or whether something more desperate might be required of him. The broad sky above Kyle Reese's farmland had taken on a grim palette of gray and violet, as though reflecting the troubling weight pressing down on his conscience. News of his new neighbor's plight, particularly the disturbing signs of harm he suspected the father had been inflicting on his family, refused to leave his thoughts. Once a diligent FBI detective, Kyle had sought out country life to escape the constant burdens of his former career. But now, the quiet fields no longer promised solace. They felt like a stage where unknown tragedies unfolded only a short distance away. Weeks had passed since Kyle first reached out to the local authorities, sharing his observations and concerns about the father next door. The father's household remained a place of profound unease. Few people came or went, and even the mother's occasional errands seemed rushed. She often sported bruises or kept her gaze locked on the ground, an indication of deep fear. The children were hardly ever visible, as though their lives were confined to the shadows of the house. At times, Kyle thought he caught glimpses of them peering through windows with haunted expressions. But they vanished as soon as they realized they were being watched. One evening, driven by a surge of worry, Kyle contacted the police once more and insisted that a serious investigation was warranted. His descriptions detailed not only the mother's bruises but also the chilling silence that enveloped the property. Whenever he tried speaking briefly with the mother, she spoke in hushed, truncated sentences. Her eyes flitted anxiously toward the front door, as if anticipating the father's sudden appearance. Kyle's insistence finally paid off. Early one morning, a dramatic sight met him: a line of police cruisers, around 10 in total, moved in a tight formation down his rural road. Their flashing lights cast alternating red and blue patterns across fields and fences. An armored van carrying a special tactical unit rumbled behind them. Kyle stood near his gate, tension twisting his stomach as he recalled the father's smug demeanor during their few encounters. He wondered how someone so apparently brazen could live with the threat of a massive police operation. From a safe distance, he watched as heavily armored officers surrounded the neighboring house, calling for its occupants to come out. Shouts rang in the still air, punctuated by the sound of a battering ram striking a locked door. Within minutes, uniformed figures guided the father out in handcuffs. Despite the overwhelming show of force, the father maintained a poised calm, the smallest hint of a smile tugging at his features. Even in custody, he gave off the impression of someone who believed he would walk free again soon. As the arrest played out, Kyle felt a fleeting sense of hope. Perhaps the mother and children would be safe at last, able to voice the full extent of what they had experienced. He pictured them giving statements, connecting with victim support services, and finding the chance to heal. He silently commended the officers and investigators for acting so decisively. The father was driven away. The police cruisers eventually departed, and the house stood deserted and eerily quiet. Kyle returned home that night with the notion that justice might finally be taking its course. Dawn arrived with an abrupt reversal of fortune. Through his kitchen window, coffee in hand, Kyle nearly dropped the mug when he spotted the father strolling toward the neighbor's front porch. Escorted by no one, he looked as confident as ever, wearing a self-assured grin that made the skin prickle at the back of Kyle's neck. The mother opened the door, her posture clearly apprehensive. Nothing about her body language suggested relief. Rather, her shoulders seemed locked with renewed tension. The father vanished inside, shutting the door behind him as though the dramatic police raid had never happened. Baffled and angered, Kyle spent the next hour on the phone with the local precinct, demanding answers. Vague explanations cited procedural delays, bail arrangements, and unnamed external influences. In other words, the father's capture had been undone in an astonishingly short time. Piecing together the hints, Kyle realized the father might have powerful connections that shielded him from standard legal consequences. Perhaps the father believed no evidence or testimony could hold him. The smirk he had displayed upon arrest now seemed an open declaration of superiority. Fearing for the family's safety, Kyle made a decision he had once hoped never to revisit. He traveled to a nearby city and met with former colleagues at an FBI field office. Though technically retired, he still carried the respect of former peers who remembered his sharp investigative skills. In a windowless meeting room, Kyle relayed the suspicious details: a dangerous individual apparently released overnight, a terrified household, and law enforcement's reluctance to pursue additional steps. His colleague explained reluctantly that the father's background included being the son of a significant political figure, an individual with the ear of powerful officials. In many places, that alone could obscure the path to justice. Kyle's colleague, wearing a conflicted expression, advised him to leave the area if possible, or to maintain a low profile. Tangling with such an influential figure could end in disaster. Even if moral righteousness was on Kyle's side. As Kyle drove home, anger and disbelief vied for space in his head. This was precisely the kind of injustice that had haunted some of his FBI cases, well-connected suspects slipping through the cracks. Victims left voiceless. He found it almost unimaginable that in a quiet stretch of farmland, he would once again confront the same twisted dynamic he had tried to leave behind. The father was not only threatening his immediate family, he was also demonstrating that his influence surpassed routine law enforcement. Back on his property, Kyle tried to gather his thoughts. He sat on his porch, letting the late afternoon sun fall across fields turning golden in the onset of autumn. His farm, a haven from past stress, now felt tainted by worry. The father's presence next door hung over every moment. Sometimes, Kyle spied the father's tall figure in the window, pacing as if in control of all he surveyed. Other times, Kyle noticed the mother stepping out briefly to drive somewhere, always glancing over her shoulder with an unmistakable nervousness. She avoided making direct eye contact, though on one occasion, Kyle thought he saw a flicker of silent pleading in her gaze. On a mild evening, when the sky was painted with streaks of orange and purple, Kyle glimpsed a startling sight. The mother stood at her mailbox, revealing injuries on her forearm that seemed fresh, even from yards away. The discoloration was noticeable. She looked utterly isolated, as if no one could shield her or her children from whatever was happening behind closed doors. Kyle's phone calls to the police resumed in earnest. But the standard reply was that they were monitoring the situation and investigating further. Haunted by the potential reality of children living in constant fear, Kyle found himself re-engaging with old habits from his detective days. He watched for patterns, noting the father's comings and goings. He also checked public records whenever possible, though he discovered little beyond the father's name, the property deed, and a network of politically linked individuals. Each dead end fortified the father's aura of seeming invincibility. Yet Kyle's personal code would not let him simply ignore these circumstances. Nothing in his training could fully prepare him for the internal struggle he faced each evening, to intervene or not. Knowing the father had influential protectors. If the father did indeed possess the near-absolute immunity his arrogance suggested, then law enforcement might not be capable of stopping him in time. Some nights, Kyle even regretted coming to the farm at all. He had yearned for tranquility. Now it felt like he was living next door to a hidden crisis that threatened not just the victims, but possibly Kyle himself if the father discovered his involvement. A few days later, Kyle's concerns sharpened. He returned from a short trip to town to find something pinned under a windshield wiper on his truck. It was a single piece of paper bearing nothing but the word "Stop." The letters were large and scrawled in black marker, though not signed. The message was clear. Kyle's mind returned to the father's self-confident stare, recalling the father's ability to coerce his own family into silence. This chilling note seemed a direct warning, an unspoken reminder that the father knew Kyle had been reporting suspicious behavior. Instead of frightening him into submission, it ignited a renewed sense of urgency. Kyle realized passively collecting evidence might not save the mother and children if the father remained free to do as he pleased. He called a friend in the local department, who acknowledged hearing rumors of something distinctly disturbing about the father's treatment of his children. Kyle pressed for details, but the friend's voice was hushed and indirect. Enough had emerged, however, to confirm that the father's behavior went beyond mere intimidation. Dangerous, possibly orchestrated wrongdoing was unfolding behind the walls of that house. Shortly after midnight one evening, as swirling clouds obscured the moon, Kyle noticed a flicker of light in the neighbor's yard. It was past the hour when most households would be asleep. But there he stood by his living room window, watching a single beam of a flashlight move within the shadowy confines of the property next door. Tension flared in his chest. He remembered how, in the FBI, nighttime hours were often chosen by individuals intending to hide something. This was not proof in itself, but it deepened his suspicions. Over the next few days, an eerie calm settled around the house next door. The father seemed to vanish or at least cut down his visible presence. The mother was barely seen except for fleeting moments. The children never appeared at all. Kyle checked local news or social media, hoping for signs of a deeper investigation, but discovered nothing. No new headlines covered the father's arrest or release. It seemed that the father's political ties had once again ensured a hush around his affairs. Feeling cornered, Kyle decided to try one more approach. He phoned a close associate in a state-level agency, not just local police, describing the entire situation from start to finish. The associate promised to look into whether higher-level involvement could bypass local political pressures. Kyle hung up, exhausted by the emotional toll, yet slightly hopeful that someone with more authority might intervene. He told himself it might only take one determined official, armed with the correct warrants and supporting evidence, to bring the father's conduct into full public view. One afternoon, Kyle glimpsed the mother stepping outside to retrieve a parcel from the front porch. The father's truck was gone. Seizing the moment, Kyle left his own porch and approached, holding a basket of produce from his garden as a goodwill gesture. The mother accepted it gingerly. Her appearance was far more strained than the last time they had spoken. She offered a quiet, polite thank you, though she avoided looking into his eyes. Kyle worked up the courage to speak softly, saying that he hoped she and the children were safe. She pressed her lips tightly, whispering something about how nothing was right at all. Before Kyle could ask more, she flinched at the sound of a vehicle approaching. She dashed inside, shutting the door with trembling haste. The father's truck rumbled up the driveway moments later. Kyle stepped back across the lawn, feigning casual distance while remaining acutely aware of the father's hard stare from inside the cab. The father parked, got out, and stood for a moment watching Kyle with a calm but piercing intensity. No words were exchanged, yet a silent confrontation transpired. In that unspoken moment, Kyle felt how confident the father was in his presumed immunity. Then the father collected some items from the truck bed and strode inside, the door closing behind him. That evening, Kyle contacted the police once more, describing the fear he had seen in the mother's face. He emphasized that the father seemed emboldened, that the children never appeared outside, and that a protective action had to be taken soon. The dispatcher's measured tone did not offer much comfort. They confirmed there were ongoing efforts to investigate. Kyle felt a familiar surge of frustration. Each day that passed was another day the mother and children remained exposed to danger. As autumn deepened, storms rolled across the farmland with dramatic force. Thunder rattled windows. Lightning painted the sky in bright flashes, and rain-drenched fields already stripped of their summer greenery. Kyle found he could not rest on stormy nights. He always stood by a window, glancing toward the neighbor's darkened house. Sometimes, he imagined the father's next outburst, the children stifling tears or the mother shrinking from the father's anger. He remembered child protection cases from his FBI career and how often criminals manipulated legal loopholes and intimidation to evade consequences. Everything came to a head on an especially turbulent night. Rain fell in sheets, splashing against the ground, while distant thunder rumbled like a warning. In the midst of this, Kyle heard a sound that shot dread through his veins, a muffled shriek. Barely audible over the weather's fury. It was coming from the neighbor's property. Adrenaline spiking. Kyle dashed to his phone and called the police, urging them to send a unit immediately. The dispatcher assured him that someone would come as soon as possible. But Kyle, recalling the father's swift release in the past, doubted that a hurried response would truly address the danger. Heart hammering, he moved to the locked case where he stored his old FBI-issued sidearm. His hands trembled as he removed it. The weapon felt heavier than ever, thick with the moral weight of what he might be forced to do. He had always prided himself on upholding the law, never resorting to lethal measures unless there was no alternative. Yet the father's repeated escapes from accountability had fostered a sense that normal procedures would fail once again. Steeling himself, Kyle donned a rain-slick jacket and stepped outside. The storm assaulted him immediately, cold water stinging his face. He made his way carefully across the soggy ground separating his property from the neighbors. Lights were off in the front windows, but the door oddly stood ajar. A swirl of wind pushed it open further, revealing a dark interior. Wary of an ambush, Kyle trained his flashlight ahead, calling out in a voice meant to announce his presence. No one answered. Inside, the house lay in disarray, as if a struggle had taken place. Overturned chairs, a broken lamp, scattered belongings. His pulse pounded in his ears as he checked each room. Not a single sign of the mother or children. The living room, the bedrooms, even the small kitchen deserted. Doors stood wide open or half off their hinges. At last, he spotted the staircase leading down to a basement. A dim glow emanating from below. The hair on his neck bristled. He descended cautiously, flashlight bobbing in the oppressive darkness. Reaching the bottom, he found a narrow concrete space faintly lit by a flickering lamp. The father stood at the far end, caught off guard by Kyle's sudden appearance. Nearby, scattered objects hinted at something deeply troubling in arrangement that implied the father had been documenting or recording vile acts. Nothing was overtly described, but the context was unmistakable. The atmosphere saturated with fear. Kyle's mind reeled, though he had suspected the father's cruelty. Seeing such evidence in front of him triggered a surge of revulsion and fury. The father pivoted, realization dawning that Kyle had intruded on his hidden domain. His posture shifted, as though preparing to wield intimidation once more. Yet Kyle's approach held a determination that even the father's usual arrogance did not seem to dissolve. For a tense moment, they locked eyes. Lightning flashed outside, sending brief illumination through a small, clouded window near the ceiling. No formal exchange of words occurred. Only the father's threatening stance and Kyle's grim resolve. In a rush of movement, Kyle smacked the father in the face with the butt of his pistol, toppling him. The father's expression twisted with a mingled shock and rage. He staggered, dropping whatever device he had been clutching. A tense hush permeated the basement as the father glared upward. Despite a cut on his brow and a bruise forming on his cheek, he let out a short laugh, tinged with that same smugness he had worn upon his release days before. In that charged instant, Kyle's mind crackled with everything he had witnessed: the mother's fear, the children's haunting silence, and the father's unbroken pattern of harmful behavior. The father's quiet mirth suggested he still believed himself invulnerable, that even discovered in the act of grievous wrongdoing, he would find a way to walk free. Thunder shook the foundations of the house. The father's chilling lack of remorse drove Kyle to a grim, fateful decision. Drawing a slow, shaky breath, Kyle raised the pistol. His training told him to maintain a steady grip, focus on the target, and avoid hesitation. Yet this was unlike any operation he had participated in as an FBI agent. It had none of the usual protocols or official sanctions. Instead, it felt like an inescapable confrontation forced upon him by the father's relentless transgressions and an ineffectual system that repeatedly let a dangerous individual roam free. For a flicker of a second, Kyle imagined an alternate scenario where the father might face a fair trial and remain imprisoned. But every brush with law enforcement thus far had ended in the father returning to the family. Lightning flashed again, and Kyle pulled the trigger. The shot resounded like a thunderclap within the cramped basement. The father collapsed. The triumphant sneer wiped from his face in an instant. A quivering, deafening silence followed. Kyle stood over him, hands shaking around the pistol, mind swimming in the enormity of what he had just done. Rain hammered above, echoing through the foundation of the house as though nature itself lamented the violent end to this confrontation. Numbly, Kyle lowered the weapon and set it on an old table. His heart pounded with equal parts horror and relief. The father's tyranny was finished. There would be no more torment for the mother and children. But Kyle was forced to confront the knowledge that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. Every principle of due process he had upheld throughout his career had collided with the unyielding reality that the father's political immunity might have allowed him to continue indefinitely. In the darkness behind a stack of boxes, Kyle heard faint movement. He swung his flashlight and discovered the 3 children, trembling in fear. They were huddled together, tears staining their faces. Kyle's chest constricted with sorrow. He beckoned them to stay put, whispering reassurance in a gentle tone, though he was not sure they could hear him through their shock. His chest tightened as he realized the weight of all they had endured. He knew that no matter how horrifying the final confrontation, at least these children would no longer live in constant terror. His first coherent thought was to call for an ambulance and the police. Whether he faced arrest or not, the children needed immediate protection. He retrieved his phone and dialed with shaky hands. Words stumbled out as he informed the dispatcher of a fatal incident and the presence of endangered minors. The voice on the other end asked clarifying questions, but Kyle answered minimally, numb from the adrenaline crashing through his system. Time blurred. He was unsure if seconds or minutes passed before sirens cut through the storm. When uniformed officers finally descended into the basement, Kyle raised his empty hands, offering no resistance. He had placed his pistol aside and stood near the children, trying to shield them emotionally with quiet, calm words. The officers drew their guns, expecting trouble, but found only the father's lifeless form and a situation rife with moral complications. Kyle identified himself an ex-FBI agent before they cuffed his wrists as a formality and led him up into the rain-soaked driveway. Flashing lights of red and blue swarmed the scene, reflecting off puddles. Kyle watched paramedics hurry inside to check on the children and search for the mother. She was found elsewhere in the house, visibly shaken and disoriented. The swirl of lights, the roar of the storm, and the confusion of voices gave the yard a surreal backdrop. Though he was being taken away, Kyle felt relief that professional help was at last enveloping the family. The father's dominance could no longer prevent them from receiving medical care and support. His gaze dropped to the muddy ground as officers guided him into a waiting cruiser, reading him his rights. It was a scene Kyle never believed would become his reality, a former lawman under arrest for killing a suspect outside of any authorized operation. Yet he harbored no intention of running. If anything, he wanted the truth of that night and everything that led to it to come to light. As distant lightning flashed across the sky, he recalled the father's final, chilling expression of confidence and realized that it had been swept aside in a single Irrevocable act. In the days following, the severity of what had transpired seized the attention of local authorities and beyond. Kyle sat in a holding cell, replaying the basement scene in his head, torn between deep remorse for ending a life and a quieter sense that the father would have continued harming his family if no one stepped in. Investigators combed through the neighbor's house, uncovering evidence that was even more unsettling than Kyle's worst assumptions. Reports circulated that the father's influential connections had shielded him for years, enabling him to escape charges at every turn. Kyle's case quickly became a local sensation, then a national one, as journalists investigated why the father had been repeatedly set free and how the system had not intervened more decisively. The mother, now safe from her abuser, gave her testimony in a protected setting. Though traumatized, she confirmed that calls for help had been overlooked and that the father had displayed an alarming level of cruelty. As fragments of the story made their way to the press, public outcry surged. The father's parent, an influential politician, faced immediate scrutiny, with questions raised about whether political pressure had subverted justice. Meanwhile, Kyle braced himself for a harsh legal battle. Though his lawyer was sympathetic, the killing of the father still placed Kyle in the crosshairs of the law. Yet evidence of ongoing harm in the father's home made it difficult for prosecutors to ignore the extreme circumstances. The children's testimony, handled gently by child advocates, offered a harrowing glimpse into the father's behavior. The mother's statement solidified the picture of a household tormented by threats, violence, and manipulative tactics. As each new detail surfaced, sympathy for Kyle grew among members of the public, many of whom saw him as having stepped in where official measures had chronically failed. All the same, Kyle spent a tense period awaiting the formal hearing, locked in contemplation of his actions. Night after night, he was haunted by the memory of the final confrontation. He wondered whether there had been a better way, some last-minute intervention from higher authorities that might have placed the father in custody for good. But each time he replayed that scenario, he remembered that every official effort had been thwarted. The father had more than once returned home almost immediately after arrests or inquiries. Neighbors seldom intervened. The mother and children were trapped in an unsafe environment. As the storm of publicity intensified, the local justice system found itself under unprecedented scrutiny. A swirl of calls, letters, and protests emerged, urging that Kyle be given a fair hearing and that the father's political protectors be held accountable for the repeated failure to shield the family. Behind the scenes, officials scrambled to distance themselves from any wrongdoing. The mother and children, placed in a protective setting, began receiving counseling and medical assistance, free at last from the father's looming threat. By the time Kyle's hearing was set, the community's anger had reached a boiling point. The father's story, initially that of a seemingly upright neighbor, was now seen as an example of how a toxic blend of influence and intimidation could erode justice at every turn. In news coverage, commentators noted that Kyle's longtime background in law enforcement lent credibility to his claims that he had tried every legal channel before taking lethal action. Even among law enforcement circles, there was an undercurrent of sympathy for the impossible position in which Kyle had found himself. And so, the second major turning point in Kyle's life after leaving the FBI had become a defining moment for the entire region. The father's name would live on in infamy, a cautionary tale of unchecked power. The mother and children had been freed, but not without a tremendous price. And Kyle, once a dedicated detective who believed in methodical processes, found himself grappling with the knowledge that he had crossed a moral line to protect innocent lives. Whether that act would be punished or forgiven by the courts was still uncertain. But he resolved to accept the consequences, certain only that he could not have stood aside any longer. In a stark holding cell, lit by a single overhead bulb, He reflected on the farmland he had once cherished. He recalled the rustling crops, the autumn sun, the tranquility he had pursued. Strange that his personal sanctuary had transformed into a stage for hidden cruelty and ultimately a decisive clash. Though weighed down by regret, Kyle clung to the idea that maybe, despite how tragic the finale had been, the children now had a future free from fear. If so, he thought, it might be the only solace in a situation that defied easy moral judgments. A subdued hush fell over the courtroom as Reese waited for the judge to appear. Dressed in plain clothes provided by the detention center, he sat at a table beside his attorney, feeling the weight of countless eyes upon him. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras and notebooks aimed at the scene. Nearly everyone in the room understood that this case had expanded far beyond a single grim altercation on a stormy night. At its core lay questions of how a system could repeatedly fail a family, and what might happen when an ordinary man once bound by professional duty had taken matters into his own hands. With a shuffle of papers, the judge finally entered, prompting everyone to stand and then be seated. The formalities commenced, though they felt surreal to Kyle. He recalled a time when he had testified as an FBI agent, presenting evidence and building a factual narrative in pursuit of justice. Now, he was the one facing legal scrutiny, accused of taking a life under circumstances that many found both morally fraught and tragically unavoidable. The prosecution began by outlining the events of that fateful evening. They spoke of how Kyle, upset by repeated signs of harm befalling his neighbors, had entered another person's home armed with a firearm. They cited pictures from the scene, gloomy, low-lit images of the basement where the confrontation had ended. By their account, Kyle had gone beyond the proper boundaries of self-defense, bypassing the law in a way that could not be condoned. The father, for all his alleged wrongdoing, had still been entitled to due process under the law. Yet as the prosecution made their case, there was an unmistakable air of caution in their tone. Public sentiment and media pressure had grown to a fervor since investigators began unraveling the father's background. At each mention of the father's reprehensible actions, a ripple went through the spectators. The mother and children had been providing statements to law enforcement and child protective agencies, and while much of it was shielded from the public to guard their privacy, enough had emerged to leave the community shocked and horrified. Even the lead prosecutor could not fully cloak an undercurrent of reluctance, as though conscious that charging Kyle too harshly might risk inflaming an already outraged public. When it came time for Kyle's defense to present their arguments, his lawyer revealed the depth of the father's influence and the extraordinary efforts made by the mother to seek protection. Official documents, heavily redacted in places, showed how local authorities had tried and failed on multiple occasions to keep the father in custody. Court transcripts, phone records, and statements from officials painted a picture of political interference at the highest levels. A man with connections so extensive that even a major police raid had ended in swift release, permitting a return to his household and to his family, who allegedly lived in constant fear. The defense leaned into these details to bolster their argument that Kyle had acted in what he believed was an immediate crisis, fully convinced the system would once again prove ineffective. In a trembling voice, an older friend of Kyle's from the bureau described him as the most by-the-book agent she had ever known. She recounted how Kyle had earned the respect of his peers through careful, methodical work that always aimed to protect both the public and suspects' rights. For him to have taken such an irreversible step suggested that he had felt no alternatives were left. Kyle observed the proceedings with a mixture of anxiety and resolve. The gravity of his choice weighed on him. He did not want to appear dismissive of the fact that a life had ended. But each time the father's victimization of his own family was mentioned, Kyle recalled the images in the basement. The bruises, The terrified expressions. And the father's unyielding belief in his own untouchable status. He could still hear the father's mocking laughter echoing in that enclosed space. Sitting there in court, Kyle braced himself, aware that no matter what emerged, he would spend the rest of his life grappling with the memory of firing the fatal shot. Outside the courtroom, the political ramifications were unraveling with startling speed. The father's influential parent, rumored to hold a position close to the president's inner circle, found himself at the center of a sprawling inquiry. Journalists uncovered records suggesting that over the years, multiple officials had received calls, favors, or pressure whenever the father faced legal trouble. A sense of collective anger brewed as ordinary citizens realized that a chain of political pull had potentially allowed harmful behaviors to continue in plain sight. News outlets ran headlines about widespread calls for resignations. Official resignations that indeed followed once it became apparent that the father's protectors had orchestrated more than a few behind-the-scenes interventions. As the trial wore on, the mother courageously stepped forward to testify via a confidential arrangement that shielded her from direct public exposure. She recounted with trembling composure how each plea for help had gone unheeded or stifled by the father's vast connections. She described her terror that after each police visit or short-lived arrest, the father would come back angrier than before. When she spoke about the night Kyle had entered the basement, her voice cracked with lingering fear and relief all at once. She maintained that Kyle's arrival had ended a situation she believed would escalate to an irreversible tragedy if left uninterrupted. Even the children's statements, gathered gently by child advocates, were included as part of the evidence. Although their identities were shielded from the public, the core of their accounts confirmed an environment of constant fear. The father had apparently promised that anyone who tried to expose him would face severe retaliation, and that no one in authority would believe their stories. He had pointed to his powerful relatives and the consistent past failures to hold him accountable as proof of his immunity. These revelations stirred raw emotion among the jurors, some of whom struggled to maintain their composure while listening to the children's experiences. Meanwhile, a wave of public support for Kyle continued to grow. Though some voices insisted that vigilantism could not be condoned in a lawful society, a far louder contingent argued that Kyle's actions had been the desperate remedy to a systemic failing. Supporters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that said they stood with him. Newspapers published opinion pieces calling for major reforms so that no one else would be forced into such a dire situation. Some editorialists even addressed the children's welfare, questioning why it had taken so long for any protective agency to step in. The father's name became a symbol of what could go wrong when influence outstripped justice. The judge, striving for impartiality, permitted extended arguments to ensure all angles of the case were heard. Day by day, evidence piled up. Forensic investigators testified that the father's property contained incriminating materials, at least partially supporting the mother's and children's accounts of the distressing environment they had endured. Records suggested the father had often boasted he would never see the inside of a prison cell, and had even mocked past arrests as mere inconveniences. One detective who had worked on the father's earlier cases described an odd sense of futility every time the father was taken into custody, only for him to reappear a short while later. Despite the emotional whirlwind and extraordinary public scrutiny, the trial progressed with a surprising thoroughness. Prosecutors displayed the basement photographs, reaffirming that Kyle had crossed from his own property onto another's armed with a weapon. They argued that a simple phone call to the authorities might have ended differently, reminding the court that law enforcement was indeed en route that evening, albeit perhaps arriving too late. Kyle's defense countered that repeated phone calls had already proven insufficient, and that in the final moment, Kyle had believed the children's lives were in imminent peril. Eventually, closing arguments arrived. By that time, the father's political patronage network had largely crumbled under the relentless pressure of investigations. The father's parent had stepped down from his high-ranking role after revelations about his involvement in tamping down legal consequences for his son. Other officials, judges, clerks, even a prosecutor or two were either under review or had resigned. In the court of public opinion, the father's once formidable aura of privilege had become a cautionary tale. Yet none of that alone guaranteed that the law would absolve Kyle of responsibility for ending a life. With final statements concluded, the jurors retreated to deliberate. People in the courtroom whispered anxiously. Reporters jotted down last-minute notes. And Kyle sat with bowed head, contemplating the path that had brought him to this point. He thought back to his arrival at the farm. The peaceful acres that had seemed so promising. He remembered the father's family pulling up in their moving truck, the children smiling uncertainly, and the father himself offering a neighborly greeting that had masked far darker intentions. How swiftly events had spiraled into something neither Kyle nor the community could have foreseen. The jury's deliberation stretched longer than many expected. Hour after hour, they pored over testimony, transcripts, and the legal framework for self-defense or defense of others. Outside the courthouse, crowds continued to assemble. Some carried signs praising Kyle's actions. Others simply wanted to see a public reckoning for the father's enablers. A handful insisted that lethal force was never acceptable. Emotions ran high on all sides. But the overarching sentiment was that something fundamental in the legal system had gone off track for a scenario like this to unfold in the first place. At last, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. A hush descended as everyone filtered back into the courtroom. Kyle stood, chest tight, heart hammering so loudly he thought the sound might carry through the entire room. The foreperson rose, a piece of paper trembling slightly in her hand. In a clear but subdued voice, she announced that Kyle Reese was not guilty on the most serious charge, the charge akin to murder. She explained that the jury had found sufficient grounds to believe that Kyle's actions were prompted by a pressing need to prevent further imminent harm. On lesser charges, the jury had also opted for acquittal or dismissal, indicating that the extraordinary circumstances had driven them to a unanimous conclusion that Kyle should not be punished as a criminal. A stunned silence reigned for an instant. And then a subtle wave of relief rippled through the room. Some spectators let out audible gasps. Others dabbed at tears or bowed their heads in relief. The mother, who had been allowed to observe from a separate area to protect her privacy, reportedly wept quietly when she heard the decision. A wave of reporters hurried outside, eager to broadcast the verdict. Kyle stood frozen, absorbing the magnitude of what this meant. Gradually, he remembered to breathe. The judge thanked the jury for their service, then looked at Kyle with a grave expression, reiterating that the decision was not a celebration of vigilantism, but a recognition that the normal system had severely failed the victims. The next day, Kyle emerged from the courthouse. Cameras snapped photos, and reporters thrust microphones in his direction, clamoring for a statement. He addressed them politely but briefly, expressing his sorrow that a life had been lost, and relief that the mother and children were now safe. He also pointed to the deeper tragedy, that repeated cries for help had gone unanswered or blocked by powerful individuals. Then, giving a polite nod to the media, he chose not to linger, slipping into a waiting vehicle that drove him away from the courthouse. In the weeks following his release, Kyle took refuge in a small cabin on the outskirts of a nearby town. Needing time to process everything, official inquiries into the father's past escalated. More details emerged about the father's hidden associations, the hush money paid to keep certain allegations under wraps, and the intimidation tactics used against potential witnesses. Government committees held hearings to assess whether corruption had permitted the father's wrongdoing to continue unchecked. The father's parent, the influential politician, was forced to testify under oath, evoking no small measure of public outrage. The politician's downfall appeared all but certain as evidence of abuse of power surfaced, removing him from the circle close to the president. Meanwhile, the mother and children moved to a new location, shielded by various resources that had finally been mobilized to protect them. Therapeutic interventions were arranged, and a network of volunteers helped them secure a private place to rebuild their lives. While the scars, physical and emotional, would remain, the mother seemed determined to ensure her children never again felt the isolation that had once trapped them. She expressed gratitude toward Kyle through intermediaries, though she declined any formal meeting. It was clear she wanted to move forward without revisiting the trauma too directly. During that time, Kyle's name became part of a broader national dialogue. Civil rights groups, family welfare advocates, and even some law enforcement officials debated the lessons of his case. Arguments emerged that the father's repeated immunity illustrated a flaw in the justice system's capacity to respond equitably. Others maintained that lethal force should only be sanctioned in the most extreme of circumstances. But nearly all participants in the discussion agreed that if the system had acted decisively at an earlier stage, the final tragedy might have been avoided altogether. The case became a driving catalyst for calls to reform how abuse allegations are handled when powerful connections are involved. Gradually, Kyle returned to his farm, uncertain if he could find peace there after all that had transpired. The farmland was still the same rolling pastures, a big sky overhead, the barn with its weathered wood. But the neighbor's house, once the site of so much dread, remained empty. For a time, it stood with boarded windows, a visible reminder of the storm that had swept through the community. Whispers circulated that some developer might purchase it, or that the county might seize it in the ongoing legal morass. Regardless, Kyle's gaze often fell on that silent property, recollecting the day the family had first arrived. He sometimes wondered if life might have turned out differently had he tried to intervene even sooner, or if there truly was nothing more he could have done within the legal framework. Neighbors began to treat Kyle with a mixture of respect and cautious curiosity. Some approached him to say they admired his courage, or to share their condolences that the situation had come to such a severe end. Others kept a wary distance, perhaps unsure how to reconcile their long-standing beliefs in the rule of law with the reality of what Kyle had done. Through it all, Kyle remained guarded. He had never wished for public attention or for his farm to become a symbol of a broken system. His initial intent had been to live quietly, to cultivate the land, and to set aside the rigors of his FBI career. That dream now felt remote, overshadowed by the knowledge that evil could surface anywhere, even on a tranquil property in the middle of the countryside. Some evenings, Kyle wandered among the rows of crops he tended, his mind drifting back to the children's frightened eyes. He kept to himself, interacting with only a few close friends who truly understood the emotional burden he carried. Memories of the trial lingered, though the fear of imprisonment had subsided. What remained was the constant introspection over the moral line he had crossed in that basement. Regardless of the court verdict or public opinion, the finality of taking a life weighed on him deeply. As the seasons changed, so did the farm. Harvests came and went. New livestock were purchased. The orchard behind his property blossomed and bore fruit. Kyle found some measure of normalcy in routine tasks, feeding animals, repairing fences, and driving into town for supplies. Over time, the public's focus gradually shifted to other headlines. The father's death, once the lead story, became a symbol in a broader conversation about systemic reform rather than an ongoing scandal. Investigative pieces about corruption were published. Committees forwarded recommendations to higher legislative bodies. And the father's family name drifted into the annals of cautionary tales. One afternoon, a letter arrived in Kyle's mailbox. The return address was from a law firm representing the mother. Inside, a brief handwritten note contained simple words of thanks and an update: the children had begun attending a new school, were receiving counseling, and adjusting to a life unburdened by secrecy. Though they faced difficulties, they were safe. And that safety was something they had seldom known before. The letter carried no illusions about the complexities of what had happened. But it acknowledged that for all the tragedy, Kyle's intervention had ultimately spared them from further anguish. Kyle stood by his mailbox in silence, holding the note, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. In the distance, the autumn wind stirred the tall grasses in a steady rhythm. That evening, he dug out a few old photographs from his FBI days. He rarely looked at them, but something about the mother's letter compelled him to reflect. One picture showed him flanked by colleagues, all wearing the serious expressions of agents about to conduct a crucial operation. Another showed him testifying in a courtroom, referencing documents pinned to a board. He realized that everything he had once done was guided by the principle that no one should be above accountability, and that every individual harmed by a crime deserved justice. He had tried his best to uphold that creed through legal channels, even in the father's case. But as the case had proven, sometimes the usual avenues failed, especially when twisted by powerful interests. Time continued its patient work of rebalancing the rhythms of the farm. Weeks turned into months. Trees shed their leaves and budded again in the cycle of changing seasons. Kyle resumed quiet, unremarkable days, seldom venturing far from the property except for errands. He exchanged pleasantries with a handful of neighbors who remained supportive, politely turned away persistent reporters still seeking an angle, and shared updates with the local authorities about any continued legal entanglements around the father's property. Gradually, that house next door became less a symbol of fear and more a cautionary fixture, one that no new family yet dared inhabit. Meanwhile, the repercussions within political circles persisted. The father's influential parent, disgraced by findings of judicial interference, was formally removed from office, his name tarnished by scandal. Other officials were disciplined or forced out, though some insisted they had only followed orders or had been misled by incomplete evidence. The mother's story, once overshadowed by the father's connections, was at last publicly recognized. Interviews carefully arranged through her legal representatives shone a spotlight on the plight of families caught in the crossfire of power. Donations poured into support organizations dedicated to safeguarding children in vulnerable situations. Public conversations intensified around how to improve protective services and minimize the sway of political interference in legal proceedings. Eventually, Kyle found a semblance of peace in seeing these broader changes unfold. They could not undo the anguish inflicted on the father's family, nor erase the trauma the children carried. Yet the public exposure of corruption and the subsequent calls for reform hinted that more families might be spared a similar ordeal. The notion that his dire actions in that basement had catalyzed significant improvements in policy and oversight provided a measure of solace, though it could not dispel his lingering remorse. One day, Kyle discovered that the mother and children had settled in a distant part of the state. He heard from a mutual contact that they were slowly building a new life. The children were exploring hobbies, making friends, and experiencing, for the first time in years, a safe and supportive home environment. At that news, Kyle felt his shoulders loosen, releasing a tension he had carried since the night he had confronted the father. though guilt still lingered, overshadowing his day-to-day tasks. He knew a measure of good had come from his actions. In the quiet hours before sunrise, Kyle often found himself leaning against the railing of his porch, gazing across the dark fields. He listened to the wind sigh through the grass and tried to banish the vivid recollection of the father's final smirk. The official verdict had deemed that Kyle would not pay a penalty under the law. But the intangible cost weighed on him each time he considered that a life, no matter how destructive, had ended by his hand. He accepted that this burden was his alone to bear. Yet in that burden, there was a peculiar sense of purpose. He resolved to do what good he could within his modest sphere. He maintained contact with a friend in Child Protective Services, sometimes quietly helping families in tenuous circumstances by pointing them toward resources. He made small donations to local programs aimed at preventing domestic harm. His approach remained understated and private. He did not want attention, only to ensure that others might find help in ways the mother and children next door had not. Seasons rolled on, and the farmland showed signs of renewal. New shoots arose from the tilled earth. Baby animals took their first shaky steps, and the cyclical motion of nature provided a steady tempo for Kyle's life. Whenever he felt the gloom of regret creeping in, he looked around at the land he had chosen, reminding himself that all living things had a right to grow free of harm. Though the father had once threatened that balance, the farmland once again carried an air of openness and safety. Over time, most of the media frenzy dissipated, though the father's story resurfaced occasionally in discussions about political corruption. Kyle's name no longer dominated headlines. The mother and children, shielded by privacy measures, gradually slipped into relative anonymity. The father's family name became a footnote in larger narratives about misused influence. And Kyle, unburdened by official charges, was left to piece together a quiet future. The boarded-up structure of the neighbor's house eventually drew the attention of developers. One day, a cluster of trucks arrived unannounced, and a small team walked the perimeter, discussing potential repairs or demolition. Kyle watched from a distance, uncertain how he felt about someone else moving in. Part of him hoped that if the place was razed or rebuilt, it might wipe away the dark memory of what had occurred. Another part recognized that no amount of external change could fully erase the past. The father's cruelty, the children's trauma, and Kyle's actions had intertwined with this patch of farmland in a way that would not easily be forgotten. Meanwhile, the changes in local law enforcement were tangible. The sheriff's department, once seemingly tangled in bureaucratic red tape, took a firmer stance on investigating influential suspects. New protocols were introduced, emphasizing the urgency of child welfare calls, especially in households with potential political or economic sway. Kyle watched from the sidelines, quietly relieved. In a sense, the father's downfall had forced introspection, compelling authorities to reconsider how they balanced fairness, caution, and the risk of further harm to vulnerable individuals. Perhaps the most telling shift was in the local mindset. Folks in the area, once suspicious of making waves, displayed a heightened willingness to call out questionable situations. A renewed sense of vigilance replaced the old reticence, as if the community had learned that silence might enable dangerous secrets to fester. Some neighbors reached out to Kyle for advice on how to spot warning signs of mistreatment, seeking to tap into his FBI background. Though Kyle felt uneasy becoming a source of expertise on such matters, he offered general guidance, hoping to prevent any future tragedies. Life proceeded with a delicate blend of sorrow and promise. The tragedy next door had ended, but the scars remained. Kyle found glimpses of healing in simple tasks, watching the sunrise over newly planted fields, guiding a calf that had wandered off from its mother. Even mending a broken fence while listening to the natural sounds of his property. Each moment of routine normalcy acted as a small salve, reminding him that despite the darkness he had encountered, the world held spaces of quiet beauty worth preserving. Now and then, news articles surfaced, chronicling how the father's influential parent was facing trial for various abuses of authority. The once powerful politician had grown silent, overshadowed by his own scandals and the departure of his allies. The same system that had once seemed impenetrable was now scrutinizing him. Kyle tried not to feel satisfaction in that downfall, recognizing it as a necessary correction rather than a personal victory. The father's misdeeds had spurred a chain reaction that might, at long last, restore some measure of accountability to the political sphere. Months passed, and Kyle decided to place the father's old property out of his daily thoughts. He turned his attention to improvements on his own farm, expanding a vegetable plot, acquiring more resilient livestock, and renovating the barn with better insulation. The steady, methodical labor proved soothing. Sometimes, the mother's letter came to mind, particularly her note about the children experiencing normal life routines, school, hobbies, friends. That knowledge acted as a guiding star, a reason to believe that what had been done, however shocking, had at least broken a vicious cycle. A year and more slipped away in this measured manner, until the father's property was finally sold. New owners, distant from the entire affair, arrived on a bright morning with a renovation crew. Within a week, the decaying boards came down. Fresh paint covered the walls, and the interior was gutted for modernization. Rumors circulated that they intended to turn the place into a vacation rental, or perhaps a quiet retreat. As construction vehicles rumbled in and out, Kyle observed from his porch, uncertain how he felt about a new family potentially living there. Yet he realized that time would continue to march on, altering even the most painful places. The day the new owners moved in, Kyle noticed a small group, a middle-aged couple, perhaps with adult children, stepping from a pickup truck. They looked around the yard with the curiosity of people ready to build fresh memories in a space once filled with misery. He weighed whether to walk over and introduce himself, but decided against it. Perhaps, in the spirit of letting the past rest, it was better that the new neighbors remain unaware of the house's full history. If they asked, he would answer. Otherwise, he resolved not to burden them with a story that had already wrought so much heartache. In private moments, Kyle sometimes experienced nightmares of that basement scene. Yet each time, he recalled that the children were now free. He reminded himself that they were safe and no longer subjected to the father's power. This thought did not erase the trauma or his sense of moral transgression, but it allowed him to endure the nightmares, and even to find a kernel of solace in the outcome. Meanwhile, the mother occasionally sent updates through a mutual contact, sparing details but confirming that healing continued. The children had begun speaking more openly about their past, guided by therapists, and were making strides academically. They still had flashbacks and fears to overcome. Yet every incremental step forward was a testament to their resilience. The mother also mentioned that she hoped to petition for permanent anonymity, allowing them a chance to start over without the weight of public curiosity. Kyle wholeheartedly understood that wish. As time wore on, the public fascination with Kyle's case waned further, replaced by new stories and controversies. Though references to the father's demise sometimes appeared in discussions about systemic failings, Kyle's name no longer attracted the glaring spotlight. In a rare candid moment, Kyle confided to an old FBI colleague that he did not mind the fade from attention. He preferred to exist in the margins, focusing on living a life of quiet diligence. The colleague observed that Kyle had done what many simply talk about: he had confronted evil where it lived. While that might not bring him peace, it had undoubtedly saved innocent lives. Ultimately, life found a new equilibrium. Kyle maintained his farm, stepped gently through each season's demands, and made discreet efforts to help others who might be vulnerable. The once empty neighbor's house now held a family who fed birds, tended flower beds, and occasionally waved across the fence. They appeared to have no inkling of the grim history that had transpired there. And Kyle saw no reason to awaken that knowledge. The farmland, which had been the backdrop for tragedy, bloomed again. Warmth and light colored the fields where shadows once loomed. Occasionally, a distant memory tugged at Kyle's mind, reminding him of how the father had arrived with a genial facade, introducing himself as a friendly new neighbor. The father had seemed approachable, a tall man with a quick smile. But behind that mask, a pattern of cruelty existed, woven and concealed by an influential network. It underscored to Kyle that darkness often lurked in unsuspecting places, that even in the tranquil countryside, one could never be fully sure what happened behind closed doors. In the end, Kyle persevered by embracing a sense of quiet responsibility. Though no official role compelled him, he upheld the principle that if someone near him was in danger, he would offer what aid he could. The moral lines remained blurred. He still wrestled with the knowledge of how he had ultimately intervened. Yet he found some measure of acceptance in acknowledging that sometimes, when all else fails, one is left to choose between unthinkable options. On a bright spring morning, a year and a half after the verdict, Kyle walked the edges of his property, surveying the blossoming trees. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers, and sunlight cascaded over the freshly tilled rows where he would soon plant seeds. Pausing by the weathered fence, he looked out toward the horizon. In the distance, a group of deer grazed in a meadow, unconcerned by human complexities. The world rolled on, renewing itself. In that moment, Kyle felt a subtle flicker of hope. Evil had once infected this little corner of land, but it had been uprooted. Laws had been re-examined. Corrupt figures had been removed, and 3 children had escaped a life of darkness. There was no undoing the past. But the future, for them at least, might hold promise. The same gentle wind that carried the sweet scent of spring also carried the memory of what had happened, ensuring that Kyle would never forget. Yet in the hush of that new day, as sunlight graced the fields, he found within himself a resilience that, like the farmland, could endure and grow toward something better.